The jungle breathed with him, slow, wet, relentless. November 1st, 1942, Guadalcanal. The kind of heat that doesn't just surround you, but inhabits you, fills your lungs like water, makes your skin a second enemy. In the pre-dawn darkness, the air hung thick with the smell of rotting vegetation, cordite residue from the previous night's shelling, and something else, something metallic and inevitable. Blood. It mixed with the volcanic soil until the ground itself seemed to bleed. Corporal Anthony Casamento of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, lay in a foxhole barely wide enough for his shoulders. Around him, the defensive perimeter at the mouth of the Matanikau River formed a thin line between the American beachhead and the 15,000 Japanese troops massing in the jungle beyond. He was 20 years old, from Brooklyn. He joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor, like so many others, driven by a rage that had no words yet, only direction. Now, 10 months later, he crouched in a hole in the earth 9,000 miles from home, his rifle hot in his hands, waiting for an enemy he could hear, but not yet see. The sound came first as a murmur, a rustling in the kunai grass, the snap of branches, then voices. Japanese voices. Not shouting, singing. Regimental songs carried across the darkness, deliberate and theatrical, designed to unnerve. Psychological warfare perfected in Manchuria and Shanghai, now deployed against these American boys who still thought war had rules. Then the forest erupted. What the Japanese commanders called a decisive assault hit the Marine line at 0530 hours with the force of a collapsing wave. Over 800 men from the Sendai Division, veterans of the China campaigns, stormed toward the American positions in a bayonet charge that belonged to another century. They came in disciplined waves, rifles fixed with steel, officers wielding swords that caught the first gray light of dawn. The Marines had been told to expect this, the Banzai charge, the human wave attack, the willingness to die that American intelligence reports struggled to categorize. But knowing something and experiencing it are separated by a chasm no briefing can bridge. Casamento opened fire. The Browning automatic rifle in his hands, a weapon designed in the last war to break the stalemate of trenches, bucked against his shoulder in steady, measured bursts. 20 rounds per magazine. He went through the first magazine in seconds, then the second, then the third. Around him, the other Marines did the same, their interlocking fields of fire creating a wall of lead that should have been impenetrable. But the Japanese kept coming. They stepped over their own dead without hesitation, without deviation, a tide motivated by something the Americans were only beginning to understand, a warrior culture that measured honor not in survival, but in the manner of death. The Marine to Casamento's left took a bullet through the throat and fell backward without a sound. The Marine to his right, a kid from Ohio whose name Casamento would later forget and then remember and then forget again in the decades that followed, stood to throw a grenade and was cut down by a burst of machine gun fire that nearly severed him at the waist. And still the Japanese came. This was not what they had been told to expect. In the spring of 1942, when the decision was made to defend Guadalcanal, American strategists had operated under assumptions inherited from the previous century. The Japanese soldier, they reasoned, was smaller, less nourished, equipped with inferior weapons, led by a military doctrine that prioritized spirit over science. These assumptions were not entirely wrong. They were simply incomplete. Yes, the average Japanese infantryman was 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. Yes, his Arisaka rifle was a bolt-action design, inferior in rate of fire to the American M1 Garand. Yes, his daily ration consisted of rice, dried fish, and pickled vegetables, a diet that would seem Spartan to the American soldier accustomed to canned meat, chocolate bars, and cigarettes included in every meal kit. But what the intelligence reports failed to capture was the psychological dimension. The Japanese soldier had been raised in a culture where individual life held meaning only in relation to the collective, the family, the regiment, the emperor, the nation. Death in service was not tragedy, but apotheosis. The Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, issued in 1882 and memorized by every recruit, made this explicit. Duty is weightier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. To die for the emperor was to achieve a spiritual purity that life could never offer. This was not fanaticism in the Western sense. It was religion, encoded into military doctrine. So when the waves crashed against the marine line that morning, they crashed with the weight of theology. Casamento's BAR jammed, a stoppage caused by sand or moisture, or simply the strain of firing 500 rounds in 15 minutes. It didn't matter. He cleared it with practiced hands, his training taking over in the space where thought should have been, and resumed firing. But the jam had cost him seconds, and seconds were the only currency that mattered. The Japanese were now at the foxhole line, not approaching it, at it. Hand-to-hand combat in the dark is not cinematic. It is not choreographed. It is clumsy and brutal and often decided by accident rather than skill. A Japanese soldier vaulted into Casamento's foxhole, bayonet forward. Casamento caught the rifle barrel with his left hand, felt the steel slice through his palm to the bone, and drove the butt of his own weapon into the man's face. Once, twice. The soldier fell. Another took his place. Casamento shot him at a range measured in inches. The muzzle flash lit the man's face for a fraction of a second, young, surprised, and then he was gone. This continued for an hour, then 2 hours, then 3. The historical record, compiled later from after-action reports, survivor testimony, and Japanese documents captured in subsequent campaigns, would describe what happened on the Matanikau that morning as a sustained defensive engagement. 14 Marines held a section of line against repeated assaults by a force 30 times their number. They held because retreat was not an option. The positions behind them contained the wounded, the command post, the ammunition stores. They held because that is what Marines are trained to do. But mostly they held because individual men like Anthony Casamento made individual decisions, moment by moment, to keep fighting when every physical and psychological impulse screamed to run. By 0900 hours, Casamento had been wounded 3 times. A bullet through the right shoulder, shrapnel from a grenade in his left thigh, a bayonet thrust that had glanced off his ribs, leaving a gash that bled freely but had somehow missed anything vital. He had stopped noticing. Pain becomes ambient after a certain threshold, just another texture in the environment, like heat or noise. What he noticed instead was the dwindling number of faces around him. The Marine line had contracted from 14 men to 7, then 5. Then 3. Then just him. The Marines on either side of his position had fallen back, not routed, but tactically withdrawn to secondary positions as their ammunition ran out and their casualties mounted. But Casamento either didn't receive the order to withdraw or, in the chaos of battle, couldn't comply. He remained in his foxhole, now a solitary point of resistance in what should have been a breached line. And the Japanese, having broken through on either side, began to converge on his position. They came cautiously now. The frontal assaults had cost them too much, over 400 dead littering the approaches to the Marine line, their blood turning the red volcanic soil to something darker. The survivors had learned respect for American firepower, so they approached from angles, using cover, coordinating their movements with hand signals. Professional soldiers fighting a professional battle. Casamento had 1 magazine left, 20 rounds. He used them carefully, firing single shots instead of bursts, making each bullet an individual decision. An officer appeared at the jungle edge, sword raised, rallying his men for a final push. Casamento shot him through the chest. The sword fell, catching sunlight as it tumbled. A machine gunner tried to set up a firing position behind a fallen log. Casamento shot him before he could chamber the first round. A cluster of infantry began to advance in a coordinated rush. Casamento dropped 2 before the BAR clicked empty. He reached for another magazine. His hand closed. On nothing. He had fired 1,700 rounds that morning. There were no more. The jungle seemed to exhale. In the sudden absence of gunfire, other sounds emerged, the cries of wounded men, American and Japanese both, asking for mothers in 2 languages. The crackle of a small fire where a mortar round had ignited dry grass. The caw of birds that had somehow survived the bombardment. And voices. Japanese voices, closer now, conversational in tone. They had realized he was out of ammunition. They approached without hurry. 3 soldiers, rifles slung, moving through the corpses of their comrades with the casual gait of men who believe the danger has passed. They spoke to each other. And though Casamento didn't understand the words, he understood the tone. Relief. Perhaps admiration. The grudging respect one warrior shows another after the fighting is done. One of them produced a cigarette and lit it, the gesture almost companionable. They had seen him now, this lone American in his foxhole, blood-soaked and empty-handed, and they were discussing what to do with him. In that moment, Anthony Casamento understood something that would take military historians decades to articulate. The difference between Western and Eastern military philosophy is not tactical, but ontological. The Western tradition, inherited from Greece and Rome, treats war as an interruption of normal life, a necessary evil to be concluded as efficiently as possible so that peace can resume. The Eastern tradition, refined over centuries of samurai culture, treats war as a revelation of life's fundamental nature, a space where truth emerges through violence, where honor matters more than outcome. These Japanese soldiers had fought well. So had he. In their framework, the battle was over. What came next was formality. They mocked him, gently almost. One made a gesture mimicking shooting, then spread his hands empty. See, no more bullets. Another laughed, the sound surprisingly human. The third began to approach, perhaps to take him prisoner, perhaps to finish it quickly with a bayonet, perhaps simply to retrieve his weapon as a souvenir. In Japanese military culture, capturing an enemy's arms was considered an act of honor, a way of preserving the warrior spirit, even in defeat. But Casamento was not defeated. Not yet. His hands, moving with a clarity of purpose that transcended conscious thought, reached down to his belt. 2 grenades remained. Mark II fragmentation grenades, pineapple-shaped, each containing 55 grams of TNT, surrounded by a serrated iron shell designed to fragment into dozens of lethal shards. He had saved them for exactly this, not consciously. There had been no time for strategy, but instinctively, the way a man saves his last breath. He pulled both pins. The Japanese soldiers saw the movement and understood it instantly. The laughter stopped. They tried to scatter, but the foxhole was too close, the jungle too thick, their surprise too complete. Casamento stood, his legs barely holding him, his vision tunneling from blood loss, and held the grenades high, one in each hand. The spoons flew free. 4 seconds until detonation, perhaps 5. He threw the first grenade into the cluster of soldiers at his 10 o'clock. It exploded while still in the air, the blast wave hammering across the clearing, tearing through flesh and foliage with equal indifference. He threw the second at a group trying to flank him from the right. It bounced once before detonating, the fragmentation pattern catching them mid-stride. Then he collapsed. The concussions from both grenades, occurring within seconds of each other, had ruptured his eardrums and cracked 2 ribs. He couldn't hear anymore, couldn't stand, could barely see. But he had done what needed doing. The Japanese advance, already stalled by casualties and exhaustion, broke. The soldiers who remained alive fell back into the jungle, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead. The assault finally, definitively, over. Marine reinforcements found him an hour later, unconscious in his foxhole, surrounded by over 200 Japanese dead. They carried him to the aid station, where a Navy corpsman worked on him for 3 hours, stabilizing the bleeding, digging out shrapnel, closing wounds that should have been fatal. He survived. Against every probability, against medical logic, he survived. But the story does not end there. The after-action reports filed in the days following the battle were clinical in their assessment. They noted the successful defense. They tallied the enemy casualties. They recommended Casamento for a Silver Star for valor. The recommendation was approved, the medal awarded, and Anthony Casamento returned to the United States in the spring of 1943, medically discharged. Another wounded veteran, in a nation that was only beginning to understand the scale of sacrifice the war would demand. For 50 years, the story remained incomplete. The full extent of what happened that morning, the hours-long stand, the ammunition expenditure, the hand-to-hand combat, the final act with the grenades, had been witnessed by men who died in subsequent battles. The official record captured only fragments. It wasn't until 1980, when a military historian researching the Guadalcanal campaign uncovered Japanese regimental records captured at war's end, that the complete picture emerged. The Japanese documents described an American machine gunner who had single-handedly held a critical position for over 3 hours, inflicting massive casualties, and who had demonstrated warrior spirit worthy of Bushido in his final stand. That phrase, warrior spirit worthy of Bushido, spoken by enemies, preserved in their records, became the key. A new investigation was launched. Surviving witnesses were interviewed. Battlefield forensics were reviewed. In 1980, 38 years after the battle, the Army Board for Correction of Military Records concluded that Anthony Casamento's actions met the criteria for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest recognition of valor. President Jimmy Carter presented the medal in a White House ceremony on September 13, 1980. Casamento accepted it on behalf of the men who had died beside him that morning. He was 60 years old, a grandfather. He owned a small business in Brooklyn. He did not consider himself a hero. He had simply done what seemed necessary at the time, what any Marine would have done in the same circumstance. This humility, this refusal to claim exceptionalism, is itself part of the story. The democratic creed made flesh, the idea that courage is not the property of elites, but the common birthright of free men. The grenades had been the symbol all along. Not the rifle, not the flag, not even the blood, but the grenades. Those 2 iron spheres, each small enough to fit in a palm, each containing enough violence to reshape the space around them. They represented a peculiar American doctrine, the willingness to destroy rather than submit, to choose annihilation over surrender, to assert individual agency, even in the face of overwhelming force. The Japanese soldiers had expected him to accept defeat gracefully, to acknowledge the mathematics of the situation and yield. They operated from a worldview where honor required acceptance of fate once the outcome was clear. But Casamento came from a different tradition. Brooklyn, 1941. A neighborhood of immigrants and strivers, where every family carried stories of old-world oppression escaped, new-world opportunities seized. His grandfather had fled Italy to avoid conscription into a king's army. His father had worked the docks, joining the Union, fighting for wages that reflected dignity rather than charity. Casamento himself had quit school at 16 to help support the family during the Depression, learning that survival was not given, but taken, that the world respected only those who insisted on respect. When he stood with those grenades, he was not making a tactical decision. He was expressing a philosophy. The idea that a man's worth is not determined by his circumstances, but by his choices within those circumstances. That freedom is not a condition, but an action. The perpetual insistence on self-determination against all forces that would deny it. This was the creed that Japanese military culture found incomprehensible, the variable their calculations could not account for, the sheer stubborn refusal of democratic peoples to accept defeat as destiny. The battle for Guadalcanal would continue for 3 more months. The Japanese would lose. Not because they lacked courage, they possessed it in surplus. Not because they lacked skill, they were among the finest light infantry in the world. They lost because they were fighting a nation that treated war as a production problem, to be solved through logistics, engineering, and overwhelming material advantage. For every Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal, America would land 3 Marines. For every Japanese rifle, America would deliver 5 Garands. For every Japanese grenade, America would drop a dozen from aircraft flying at altitudes Japanese fighters could not reach. But beneath the statistics, beneath the tonnage and the kill ratios and the strategic assessments, was a simpler truth. Men like Casamento, unremarkable in peacetime, extraordinary only when circumstances demanded it, embodied a form of power that could not be measured in divisions or calibers. The power of a man who believes himself the equal of any other man, who will not bow, who cannot be made to accept subjugation. This was the ultimate weapon in the democratic arsenal, the one advantage that numbers could not capture. The jungle on Guadalcanal has reclaimed the battlefield now. The foxholes have eroded, filled with silt and vegetation. The bones have been recovered, repatriated, buried with honors in cemeteries half a world apart. The weapons have rusted into the soil, slowly returning to ore. In another generation, the physical evidence will be gone completely, absorbed back into the earth that witnessed it. But the story remains. It persists because it contains a truth larger than its details. November 1st, 1942. A Marine corporal, wounded and alone, standing with a grenade in each hand, defiant in the face of death. The Japanese soldiers who saw it understood, in that instant, that they were not fighting an army. They were fighting an idea. And ideas, once unleashed, cannot be killed with bullets. Anthony Casamento died in 2002 at the age of 80. He is buried in Long Island National Cemetery, among thousands of other veterans whose names mean nothing to those who pass by, but whose actions purchased the world we inhabit. His Medal of Honor citation is 37 words long. It does not mention the grenades. It does not need to. Those who understand will understand. Those who don't cannot be made to. The war ended. The soldiers came home. The memories faded into history, and history faded into myth, and myth faded into the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we fight. But on certain mornings, when the heat rises early and the air hangs heavy, there are those who remember. Not the tactics or the outcomes, but the moment itself. The moment when one man stood and said no. Not to an army, not even to death, but to the idea that any human being can be made to kneel. That is the inheritance. That is what the grenades symbolized. The refusal. The eternal, democratic, unquenchable refusal. It echoes still, across decades, across the silence of graves, across the distances we place between ourselves and the violence that purchased our comfort. It whispers from the jungles of Guadalcanal, and the beaches of Normandy, and the mountains of Korea, and the rice paddies of Vietnam, and every other place where ordinary men discovered they were capable of extraordinary things. Anthony Casamento stood with grenades in his hands because he could not kneel. And because he could not kneel, we do not have to. That is the bargain. That is the debt. That is the story that must be told, again and again. Lest we forget what freedom costs, and who paid the bill. The jungle breathes still, slow, wet, wet, relentless. But it breathes over free soil now. That is the difference. That is everything.